Greetings and welcome on behalf of the Lumen Christi Institute to this sixth installation of our series on reason and beauty in Renaissance Christian thought and culture. My name is Michael Le Chevalier and I'm Associate Director of the Institute. First, I want to extend a word of gratitude to the American Cusanus Society, who are our co-organizers of this series. And I'd also like to call attention to our co-sponsors, the Beatrice Institute, the Calvert House, the Genealogies and Modernity Project, the Harvard Catholic Center, the Nova Forum for Catholic Thought, and the St. Paul's Catholic Center. Each of these are doing their effort to try and extend word about this event and help it to be a success. Before we turn to today's event, I want to call attention to a few upcoming events. It's a very rich week for the Catholic intellectual tradition, as well as it is next week. We are hosting a masterclass for students, undergraduate students, as well as graduate students on Newman's challenge to the modern university that is looking at Newman's idea of the university with Father Stephen Fields. If you've never experienced a masterclass with us, this is an opportunity for 20 to 30 students to work with a master interpreter or master reader of texts. This is taking place this Thursday, and we still have a few spots, so feel free to spread word to any students that you may know who might appreciate it. This Thursday, we are also holding a lunchtime event entitled Chicago Catholics and the Quest for Interracial Justice, featuring Karen Johnson and Cecilia Moore. And next Tuesday, this series continues with a lecture on Giordano Bruno and the Poetry of the Cosmos, featuring Valentina Zaffino from the Pontifical Lateran University and the University of Notre Dame at Rome. Then we have another masterclass next week for students on the eternity of the world, Aristotle, Bonaventure, Aquinas, and Kant, that is taking place over 2 days. Do check out our website for more information on that. And finally, next week, we are also holding another event addressing race, but with a more contemporary picture than our event this Thursday, COVID and the Color Line, Race, Religion, and Public Health, featuring Yolanda Wilson from Howard University, Shawnee Daniel Sykes from Mount Mary University, and Vincent Lloyd from Villanova University. All of these are part of our efforts to make the Catholic intellectual tradition a living dialogue partner at the university and within the broader culture. You can help support our efforts with this in two different ways. First, you can help spread word. Certainly during the time of COVID, a lot of people have been sheltering in place, but now as things begin to open up, we'd love to have your help to try and get word out about this to further reaches. So please do share our emails with others. You can also help support us by donating today at www.lumenchristi.org/donate. All right, I'll turn it over to Rob now, who has been moderating this series and who will introduce our speaker. Thank you again for joining us.
Indeed, thank you, Michael. And I'd like to welcome you again to the sixth presentation in our series, Reason and Beauty in Renaissance Christian Thought and Culture. This series highlights ways that rational and aesthetic pursuits interlocked and fed each other in the Christian thought and culture of the Renaissance period. And we are very pleased to present this as a collaboration with the American Cusanus Society and our co-sponsors. You can find previous presentations, including on Dante, Ficino, the rich intellectual world of women humanists, and the others on YouTube. Upcoming presentations feature very exciting topics and figures, including next week, the notorious and creative Giordano Bruno. And after that, a presentation on Cambridge Platonism, which promises to go back as a development and a reception of the work of earlier figures in the series, such as Ficino. At any time in the presentation tonight, you can ask a question using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of at the conclusion of the presentation, we'll have a moderated Q&A period with our presenter. I want now to welcome Professor Christopher Nygren. Professor Nygren teaches courses in the Department of the Department of History of Art and Architecture, there we go, at the University of Pittsburgh, where he also directs the Medieval and Renaissance Studies program. His research focuses on the religious, philosophical, and artistic interactions, and has published many articles, and most recently a book, hot off the press and exceedingly relevant for the presentation tonight, entitled Titian's icons, charisma, tradition, and devotion in the Italian Renaissance. So who better to speak to us on Titian and the Christian intellectual tradition? We are very glad to welcome Professor Nygren to speak with us tonight. Professor Nygren, can I invite you now to turn on your camera and to unmute yourself? Wonderful.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Everything is
loud and clear.
All right, perfect. Yes, here is the book that Robert was just mentioning, hot off the presses. Ways in which I would approach the book slightly differently if I were doing it now, in all honesty, in the summer of 2020, to think about what it is that I have done in the book and what it is that escaped my vision. And so I'd really like to thank the organizers for offering me an opportunity to do this, to all of you for taking an evening out of what is a certainly unusual and crazy summer to be with us and to think with us. And to the other presenters in the series, I think there are a lot of points of overlap between my presentation and the others. And so I'll try to highlight some of those as we go. And so now I will go ahead and begin sharing my screen so that we can see the presentation. Okay. And I am going to go ahead and read this citation in Italian, but the English is there for you to read along. Tiziano non è dipintore, e non è arte la virtù sua, ma miracolo. E ho opinione che I suoi colori siano composti di quella erba meravigliosa, lo quale, gustato da Glauco, d'uomo in Dio lo trasformò. E veramente i suoi ritratti hanno in loro un non so che di divinità, che, come in cielo il nostro paradiso delle anime, così pare che nei suoi colori Dio abbia riposto il paradiso dei nostri corpi, non dipinti, ma fatti santi e glorificati dalle sue mani. These words, written by the polyglot humanist Speroni around the middle of Titian's career, around 1542 or so, can help redescribe the career of one of the most recognized and critically acclaimed artists of the Renaissance. Born around 1490, Titian's life spans the religious turmoil of the 16th century. He was slightly younger than Luther and Erasmus, and likewise slightly younger than the three Ninja Turtles who are most emblematic of the High Renaissance. Donatello is his own kind of problematic case. Leonardo, Raphael, and Michelangelo, of course, being the most famous. But Titian became the only serious rival to Michelangelo. He's the only person to contend with Michelangelo in any serious way. They met in Rome in 1546, and perhaps a couple of other times, but the documents are quite scarce. Speroni's description of Titian's style is unique among artists of the period. Speroni consciously evokes the doctrine of transubstantiation. Like a priest, Titian is understood to confect the bodily presence of the sitter through the work of his hands. No other Renaissance artist, not even Michelangelo, received such a theologically rich description of their pictorial style. And yet, theology is not usually one of the first things that one thinks of when you hear the name Titian. If the name conjures anything at all, it is probably images of a different sort. A painting like the Venus of Urbino, or perhaps the Triumph of Bacchus, or Diana and Actaeon. Titian's depictions of the female body are seen as the beginning of a tradition of painterly subjects and techniques that pass through artists like Velázquez and down to Manet. But if we follow the description offered by Speroni, it highlights a surprising fact. Titian is the only painter to have been credited during his lifetime with producing a miracle working image. That is to say, while he was still alive, he was believed to have produced a painting that worked miracles. The San Rocco Christ carrying the cross, which you see here, began working miracles in 1519. The empirical identity of who was responsible for painting it, its real author, if you were, remains a real point of contention among scholars. However, the real authorship is not what I'm most interested in. It's most important to understand that the San Rocco picture was understood as a work by Titian. Already in 1520, Titian made a supplemental frame for the icon. You can see it here, and you can see how closely it resembles the magnificent altarpiece that he made for the Franciscan Church of Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari, which incidentally is next door. So you can see how close they are in their presentation of a heaven that opens up with golden light. So from an early date, from 1 year after its activation, Titian was inextricably linked to the miraculous powers of that painting. And this was reinforced just a couple of years later when Titian produced a woodcut for the Scuola di San Rocco, for the confraternity. And this cited the miracle working icon. You can see it up there in the heavens appearing just above. And am I sharing the presentation? I am sharing. Oh.
No, it's coming through perfectly.
Okay, but are you seeing 2 images or 1?
I'm seeing the three images.
Ah, okay. So it's just on my screen that it's a little bit weird. Okay. He produced this woodcut that cites the miracle working icon. This is when the move toward attributing the painting to Titian really begins to kick into gear. It begins to gain momentum, and it is made explicit in the year 1568, so about a decade before Titian dies, when Giorgio Vasari publishes his Lives of the Artists. This is basically the first book of art history. So I want you to think about that for a second. Titian's earliest documented painting is this picture here, which was made in 1508, and he doesn't die until 1576. So for 57 years, Titian lived as the guy that was responsible for painting a miracle-working icon. What kind of pressure does that place on him? This is the question that I try to answer in the book that I just recently published with Penn State Press, and please excuse the self-promotion, but through the end of July, you can get it with a 40% discount if you go to the Penn State Press website and use the promo code NR18. So what I want to do tonight is describe a little bit of what I try to do in that book, which is to find and to follow the pastoral pictorial strategies that Titian developed to help beholders engage with icons, non-miraculous icons, in a way that made them potent, in a way that gave them some power that somehow resembled the power of the miracle-working image. One of the things that became clear to me when I was studying Titian is that he is a master of dramatizing the most crucial moment in biblical narratives. He was able to identify the Kairos of a story. By Kairos, I just mean the propitious moment, the moment of a decision, the moment of action. Kairos can be instantaneous, it can be a split second, or it can also dilate to occupy a significant duration of time. It can be something kind of like a flow state if you're working and you really lose track of yourself in your work. That flow state is in its own way a kind of Kairos, but so is the moment of a religious conversion. Now, it may be a moment that also might take 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. 1519 was a propitious moment for Titian. He did not choose his role as a painter of a miracle-working icon. The San Rocco Christ was declared a miraculous painting by the people. They believed that it worked. They believed that it was a miracle-working icon. Titian's identity as an artist was entirely incidental to them. They didn't care who had made it. But the miraculous powers were crucial, became crucial to his identity and to his biography. And they provided some interesting constraints within which he had to build his own artistic identity. He was constantly experimenting with painting icons, and this resulted in different strategies at different times. What succeeded in, say, 1516 didn't necessarily still work in 1550. So the paintings that I am calling icons are all of intimate size and format. They're about 150 centimeters by 150 centimeters, so that's about 4.5 feet by 4.5 feet or so. They are half lengths, which means that the people in them are about life size. So if you're standing in front of this painting in the Church of San Rocco, or today in the Scuola di San Rocco, the Christ figure is about the same size as you. Focusing on Titian's position within the tradition of icon paintings gives us a really different sense of who he is as a painter. Early in his career, he produced bespoke, artistically ambitious icons that forced beholders into really original and original exegetical postures. One of the most intriguing paintings that he ever made is this picture in the Doria Pamphili collection in Rome. It shows a young woman accompanied by a maidservant. On a trencher, she carries a severed male head. So this is clearly the Old Testament figure Judith, retreating from the camp of the Assyrian general Holofernes, whom she has just beheaded, right? Or is it Salome, who saunters with the head of John the Baptist, which has just been handed to her on a plate after she forced Herod to have him beheaded? By 1516, when Titian painted this picture in Ferrara for the Este Duke, both of those stories had really well-developed iconographic traditions. Judith was always depicted with a sword, and frequently, though not always, with a maidservant, whose name is Abra. Salome, by contrast, is usually shown accompanied by an executioner. Sometimes it's only the hand entering from the side of the picture, but there's always somebody else with her. Titian made a choice. By eliminating the sword and altering the relationship between the protagonist and her servant, he created a painting that neatly aligns with neither iconographic tradition. In so doing, Titian underlines the iconographic similarities between the two stories. Both of them resulted in a severed male head. But he also did something interesting, which was to create confusion about the identity of the protagonist. Is she the virtuous Old Testament heroine who used her body to seduce the general and, as a result, saved the Hebrew nation? Or is she the New Testament temptress who sensuous danced and trapped Herod in an oath from which he could not escape? Titian's painting draws these two identities together and holds them in tension, inviting the beholder to investigate the erotic logic that underwrites both pictures. Remember, in both cases, a powerful man was caught out because he could not check his desires. How could thinking about the chain of causation that resulted in this severed head, that led up to this moment of execution, be used to discipline the painting's first beholder, a super powerful military man, the Este Duke of Ferrara? By investigating the interplay between eros, ethics, and devotion, the picture aligns with a philosophical movement at the Ferrarese court that was spearheaded by a philosopher named Mario Equicola. And he was investigating eros as a force in philosophy, in religion, in poetry, in all forms of what we would now maybe call something like civilization. And all of this was done in the 1510s in response to Marsilio Ficino's work on eros, which we heard about a couple weeks ago in Denis Robichaud's presentation on Marsilio Ficino. So in that same year, 1516, while he's in residence at Ferrara, Titian is not only thinking about eros, about love, about desire, but he also makes this remarkable icon, which illustrates Matthew 22:21. That is to say, Christ's famous dictum, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. This icon was made in 1516 to serve as a cabinet cover for a collection of ancient coins. So it was basically, like a door, like a cabinet in your kitchen, and behind it were kept hundreds of ancient coins. This has two really important ramifications. First, when the ruler, Alfonso d'Este, took his key and opened up the cabinet, peeling away the picture, and then he extracted an ancient coin, he examined it to determine the identity of the emperor who was on the coin. And when he did that, he was actually engaged in an important form of Christomimesis. That is to say, he's doing the same thing that Jesus did. Christ's lesson about paying taxes to Caesar is preceded by a question. Show me, whose image and likeness are on the coin? So coin collecting for Alfonso becomes a kind of spiritual exercise as Alfonso puts on the mask of Christ and he inquires in persona Christi, asking the exact same question that Jesus did. Whose image is on this coin in my collection? Perhaps more importantly, the picture draws on a long-standing trope of the coin as a metaphor for the soul. As a ruler imprints his likeness on currency, so too did God impress each soul with his likeness. And this is all over the exegetical tradition. Here's the glossa ordinaria. According to Augustine and many others, rediscovering the divine likeness imprinted on one's soul is an act of spiritual reformation. So rather than speak about a division of the world into a sacred and a secular authority, the picture forces a beholder into a spiritual posture that is radically original by asking two mutually enforcing questions. Whose image is on the coin, the physical thing that the Duke holds, and whose image is on your soul? Questions, the picture seems to insist, can initiate the work of spiritual reformation. Questions emerge from the peculiar way that Titian has staged the temporality of his icon, capturing the moment of Christ's question, whose image is on the coin? This is an example of him finding the Kairos of the story. Exegetes have always marveled at how Christ answered a question with a question, and this was his way of avoiding punishment by the Roman authorities. That kind of cleverness showed Christ was not only virtuous, but also intelligent. Around these same years, Titian was finding the Kairos in other moments of Christ's decision-making as well. I'd like us to look at another fairly rare biblical subject, at least rare up until about this period, which is Christ and the Adulterous. In most half-length, extreme close-up paintings of this subject, Christ is at the center of the composition. He looks out at the beholder with his shoulders square to the picture plane, and in many of them, his gesture is recognizable as one of absolution. Here he is absolving the woman of her sin. The frontality of these pictures indexes their connection to a tradition of images of the holy face. Titian redirects attention away from the obvious question of adultery, and instead points to the plenitude of the moment, to conversion. In this, Titian follows most pre-modern commentaries on the story, which read the story as being about reformation of the entire human person. Having been born in a state of sinfulness, everyone is guilty in the eyes of God, not just the poor woman caught in adultery. Christ's admonition to the adulteress to go and sin no more was thus taken as a universal directive that was aimed at everyone who was reading the gospel or looking at the picture. So this is a tropological mode of reading in which the message circulates from the text into the lives of the readers or into the lives of the beholders. The 4th century bishop of Milan, St. Ambrose, clearly saw it that way. Quote, "What is the meaning of go and sin no more? It is this, since Christ hath redeemed thee, suffer thyself to be corrected by grace." He's not speaking about the woman, he's speaking about you, reader. Ambrose works to direct Christ's words outward. In the 13th century, Ludolf of Saxony, who wrote one of the most important books of the Middle Ages, which is basically a narrative retelling of the life of Christ, he glosses the story in a very similar way. Quote, "What moral does the dismissal of the adulterous wife signify? In a similar way, the Lord receives the adulteress every day when he receives whatever soul has been corrupted through sin by the devil. The wife who has been caught in adultery signifies every person who has been betrothed to Christ through faith, but who later commits the mortal sin of adultery with the devil," end quote. So for Ludolf, this is clearly not a story that's about adultery, right? Titian makes this kind of reading easily legible. Unlike other paintings of the subject, Titian constructs it around two foci, one on either side of the central axis of the painting. Christ holds down the left side of the picture, while the adulterous woman bathed in white light dominates the right. Rather than focus on the absolution of the adulteress, Titian shows the immediate impact of Christ's teaching on the crowd of bloodthirsty scribes and Pharisees. Remember, they're here to carry out capital punishment. And note the arms that grasp the adulteress and how large and muscular they are. They intimate the violence with which she's been dragged from her private residence into the public sphere. And that violence is also registered in the way that her camise is about to fall off of her shoulders and expose her breasts. Now we know Christ's famous words, "Let he among you without sin cast the first stone." As the gospel writer notes, quote, "The crowd hearing this went out one by one, beginning with the oldest," end quote. That's John 8, verse 9. Titian shows the crowd beginning to disperse, it's true, but he complicates or contradicts the Bible, which states that it was the eldest members to leave first. The elders had lived out their full lives, and presumably they'd sinned a fair amount, right? And this made them less likely to cast capital judgment on the adulteress. Now, in the background, there is a figure whose head drags behind. His gaze is resting on the spectacle as he walks away. His body is no longer facing the scene. He's turned around. And he clearly is not the oldest member of the crowd. His fulsome locks and his lack of facial hair mean that he is certainly younger than the two figures closest to Christ, whose seniority is telegraphed through their weathered complexions, their beards, and their thinning hair. He's a lot closer in age to this figure in this enigmatic painting in Vienna that you see in the lower left. Scrutinizing these two elders, we recognize that they are in the process of absorbing Christ's teaching. Though it's somewhat difficult to distinguish at first, the figure with the gray beard holds a scroll. Squiggly lines of black paint stand in for text, and the curving edge of the scroll is legible in the man's right hand. The scroll is meant to be indicative of the law of Moses, which requires that the adulteress be stoned to death. Marco Marziale's painting, made about these same years, has a similar problem. While Marziale's Pharisee obstinately proffers the written word, Titian captures the moment when the Pharisee relents from his insistence on applying the law of Moses. Lowering the written word out of his sightline, he gazes on the living word, who has fulfilled the law of Moses by tempering it with mercy. The quality of the man's gaze is pretty remarkable. His eyes are softened by the lifting of his brow, which betokens a kind of clear-sighted marvel. Titian captures the moment of conversion. For Titian, the story of Christ and the adulteress does not appear to regard the specific act of the sin. Instead, it portrays the narrative as both an event that is universal and individualized. The living word of Christ's teaching, that is to say the Logos, has supplanted the written word of the law of Moses. In the biblical event, Christ was not teaching about something obvious, that adultery is bad. That's not a hard message to take in, right? Instead, he's challenging the Christian beholder to imitate the sincerity of conversion, not just of the adulteress, but also of the two elderly men who have recognized the wisdom of Christ's teaching. This is the moment of conversion. It is the iterability of conversion that is the proper subject of this picture. Now, the readings that I've set forth so far reveal that prior to about 1540, Titian's icons operated as a visual corollary to the Philosophia Christi. This is the philosophy of Christ. And this is a devotional approach that was being developed in these years by Erasmus and Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples and other Catholic theologians in these years, in the first sort of quarter or third of the 16th century. The Philosophia Christi emphasized the radical autonomy and sufficiency of the Word of God, both as Jesus but also as the Bible. As Erasmus stated, the Philosophia Christi was, quote, intended to describe a way of life, not a method of learning. And according to one modern scholar, James Tracy, it focuses on how Christians live, not the creedal statements that they espouse. So the Philosophia Christi is a theology of logos, of the living word. It appreciates Christ in the multifaceted manifestations as divinity through the word made flesh. That is, through the entirety of Christ's life as it is recounted in the Gospels. This explains why most of the icons that Titian produced, up to about 1540 or so, illustrate episodes of Christ's teaching rather than traditional episodes of the Passion narrative. Titian presents Christ's life and words as the stuff of imitation. Now, around mid-century, Titian's approach to producing biblical icons underwent a major revision, largely because of the shifting terrain of religious orthodoxy. In 1545, the Council of Trent convened, and the theological optimism of the first half of the century was supplanted. The Philosophia Christi now became seen as an adumbration of the Lutheran doctrine sola scriptura. Titian sought, after this moment, to produce icons that aligned with the devotional climate of the era of Trent. And generally, this meant that he retreated to more traditional iconographies, especially rooted in the Passion narrative. In 1547-8, he produced a painting of the Ecce Homo, that is to say, Christ being presented to the people by Pilate with the words, "Behold the man, Ecce Homo." This was made for the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The painting is remarkable for a number of reasons. First, it is clearly derived from the Imago Pietatis. This mosaic icon, it's quite small, was believed to be a miracle-working image, and it was one of the most famous images in pre-modern Christianity. It was held in Rome, And if we flip the image along its vertical axis, the similarities between this image and Titian's painting become clear. And I should underline that Titian did this all the time. He's playing with images spatially in his brain. It's quite within his realm of possibility. Beyond mimicking the iconography of the Imago Pietatis, Titian's picture also replicates the picture's materiality. The Imago Pietatis is a mosaic, and this helps explain one of the more puzzling aspects of Titian's painting. It is painted in oil on a slab of slate, that is to say, a piece of rock. Modern scholars understand that mosaic, the material on the left, could be made of stone, of glass, or lots of other materials. But in the Renaissance, mosaic was described as stone, regardless of its materiality. The Gregorian icon, so the image on the left, was thought to be an image, a painting, that was made with stone. Titian took that visual typology and he spread it on top of stone. In doing so, Titian activated lots of commonplaces that were associated with Christ and stone. The stone that was rejected by the builders, for example. But more importantly, the kind of stone on which Titian painted Christ was frequently used as a touchstone to gauge the quality of precious metals like gold and silver. So you scratch things on it to see if they're 24 karat, 22 karat. You have a whole system of figuring that out. So Titian's painting becomes a kind of touchstone against which the beholder is asked to test the solidity of their own faith, to test the purity of their heart. This is captured in a poem written about 75 years after the painting was made by the poet Giambattista Marino. O piteous paragon, who shows an incomparable excess of love, bleeding and bloody in the throes of pain. The man was wise who laid down this beautiful design on this kind of stone. For just as it would indict a false medal, so too when I come to you, will your innocence reveal my every fault. Now, in October of 1568, Titian delivered this painting to Philip II. So Charles V's son, Charles, is at this point has passed away, and Philip is now the Emperor of Spain. This scene, this painting, shows the scene from Matthew 22, give to Caesar unto Caesar. Though it's the same subject, it's hardly a copy of the painting that he made 50 years before and that we discussed a couple of minutes ago. Indeed, in many ways, the later version seems to disavow any affiliation between itself and the first version of the subject. The London version tries to make explicit to all viewers the message that was withheld from all but the most intelligent beholders of the first painting. You had to know a lot of exegesis, a lot of theology to really understand what was happening in the first painting. The first picture compressed the biblical narrative into a space whose dimensions were determined by the size of Alfonso's cabinet of coins. Comparatively, the London version seems sprawling. The composition has widened considerably, and it's transformed into an almost square picture space. The intense bodily proximity between Christ and the Pharisee has been diffused. Moreover, the painting's dramatis personae have expanded. This painting includes a third figure. This man's presence does little to enhance the action of the narrative. His gaze seems entirely undirected. Even with the aid of corrective lenses, he fails to see, both literally and metaphorically, the events unfolding before him. By contrast, the Pharisee, the man just to his right, looks at Christ with an intensity that we recognize from the elders in the Christ and the Adulterous. His brows arch high and his eyes are wide open, suggesting conversion and recognition. The shift in facial expression from deceit to clear-eyed recognition shows us that the scope of the second version is radically different from the first version. This can be seen in the lower register too. In the first version of the painting, Christ reaches for the coin. He will take it into his hand and he will ask, whose image is on the coin? Thus asking the beholder to think about whose image is stamped on their soul. In the second picture, Christ's hands splay apart, almost as though they're repelled by a kind of magnetic force. Examining the coin is not actually a part of his plan. This is utterly distinct from the earlier picture's tight presentation of gesture, where Jesus is about to take it into his hand. Christ's gesture in the second picture is clearly legible as a gesture toward heaven, toward things of greater importance. Titian took the story and made it autonomous, more easily exportable. You don't need to know about the theological parallels between coins and the human soul in order to receive the message of this picture. Jesus's finger pointing heavenward does all the work for you. The painting is simpler. It is more didactic. And a reproductive engraving of the painting made by Martino Rota under Titian's supervision makes this point crystal clear through the text that is added at the bottom. Rather than give the biblical text, though, Rota's print presents a Latin paraphrase of the story, which can be translated as follows. The tribe of the Pharisees, wishing to tighten Jesus in a snare through his words, the Pharisees asked him if it is lawful to pay tribute to Caesar or to God. A coin was shown to Christ according to command, and it held the impressed image of Caesar, to which Christ said, "To the ruler, pay what is the ruler's. Give to God what belongs to God." While the Pharisees' version turned Christ's question, whose image and inscription are on the coin, it turned that into the central thing. In the second version, that question doesn't even appear. The painting and the print operate as commands rather than as questions. More importantly, the emphasis on Christ's word as a moment of teaching has entirely receded. There are no biblical citations in this paraphrase, and even the epigrammatic power of Christ's clever response, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's, that has been rephrased in such a way as to drive a wedge between taxes and spiritual debts. Note that he's used two different words in Latin, reddite and pendere, which express two different kinds of valuations. So one's interpretation of the painting is guided by a text here. The Dresden picture granted a considerable amount of leeway to the beholder. Titian's late icon reveals something completely different. The beholder here can't quite be trusted. Now, around this same time, Titian also revisited another earlier composition that we examined just a couple of minutes ago. That picture brought together Judith and Salome into a single painting that explored the theology, philosophy, and psychology of Eros. But what was possible in 1516 was no longer possible or sustainable around 1570. In a series of paintings, Titian now very clearly distinguished between the Old Testament heroine and the New Testament temptress. Salome now dances with the head of John the Baptist and gazes bashfully at the beholder, appearing uncomfortable with the sexualized role that she now occupies. Judith, on the other hand, assertively gazes out at the beholder, proffering to them the severed head of Holofernes, which she is about to stuff into an open sack that is held by an African servant. There is no confusing the subject matter. Explicitness in subject is the key. And in the name of being explicit, as Titian was, I feel it is important to take this moment to say a few things about the African servant in these two paintings, and what they reveal about Titian's shifting approach to devotional pictures. We must first acknowledge that Titian was part of a society that was developing a racialized view of slavery. Slavery was present in Renaissance Venice, not the kind of chattel slavery that is distinctive of the American tradition, but slavery nonetheless. And over the course of his lifetime, slavery in Venice took on a new complexion. Throughout the Middle Ages, the slave population of Venice, and Italy more broadly, had been made up mostly of Eastern Europeans. After the Portuguese opened the trade routes to Africa in the 1440s, the slave population in Venice, as elsewhere, became mostly Black Africans. Recent research, especially by Kate Lowe, has demonstrated that by about 1500, there was a significant population of Black Venetians who had been manumitted, who had been set free. As free persons, many of them became gondoliers, that most Venetian of occupation. Carpaccio's painting of the miracle of the True Cross on the Rialto Bridge, or his illustration of a hunting scene on the Venetian lagoon, both of which include Black gondoliers, are neither fantasies of racial harmony nor images of an exoticizing other. They show Black gondoliers, of whom there were hundreds, simply trying to make a wage. In my book, I discuss these two paintings of Judith, but the issue of race is largely ignored. It is important for me, as a scholar of Titian, to recognize and to articulate that he contributed to a stereotyped representation of Black people that in many ways has had a lasting impact and that feeds into anti-Black racism even to this day. For as beautiful as a painting of like Diana and Actaeon is, and believe me, I love this painting. I wrote my very first seminar paper on this painting at Notre Dame many, many years ago. It's one of the reasons I study Titian. For as beautiful as a painting like that is, it is also crucial for those who love Titian to acknowledge that the painting is wrapped up in the history of enslaving Black people. Diana's nymphs are all white, while her servant is Black. And one of the difficulties in studying this is that the 16th century Italian language was very, very unclear in the distinction between servant and slave. Similarly, Titian's painting of a Black African in the portrait of Laura Dianti captures a real person, a person whose identity has been lost to history, but whose subjugation to a great lady of European history has been immortalized in oil and pigment. Simply put, the white woman has an identity. She's a subject. She is a thinking I in the modern sense, while the enslaved Black person is an object. Titian's depictions of Black people reveal to us the beginnings of a specifically racialized mode of thought that is with us to this day. George Floyd was killed 58 days ago on May 25th, and this summer has been marked by protests ever since insisting that Black lives matter. 5 days ago, the legendary congressman and activist John Lewis died. While it would be folly to make any direct connection between those events and Titian, it is also unsustainable to say that there is no continuity between the stereotyping of Black individuals in Titian's paintings and the racialized violence that has been all too present in American society, in European society, this summer and in every summer, from 1968 to 1863 to 1776 to 1619. In studying Titian, I have come to see how the history of art has often impeded an understanding of the ways in which religious art and the Renaissance operated, religious art in the Renaissance operated as an inquiry into modes of being, into ethics. The discipline's discomfort with religious art has encouraged fruitful considerations of other themes like style, an analysis of art in the servants of power, and how artworks helped shape communities. But the secularizing narrative of art history leaves little space for the consideration of religion as an imaginative and creative inquiry into one's being in the world. My hope is to illuminate Titian's attempts to reconcile religion and ethics, to show how religious art might serve as an engine for inquiry into ethical modes of being, and thereby offer historical perspective on one of the tensions at the heart of modernity. Titian is a truly gifted painter who dedicated a great deal of time, energy, and thought to how he could visualize the Christian message in a way that gave it potency in the mind of its beholders. Despite his blazing pictorial intelligence, Titian, like the founding fathers of the American experiment, had feet of clay. To appreciate his ethical commitments, the way that he called his beholders to conversion, necessitates that we also recognize the blind spots in that vision. There is power in his paintings, in his visual analysis of the movements of the heart and the mind. His pictorial imagination registers some of the most beautiful and fleeting aspects of the human experience. A moment of recognition, the touch of a baby's flesh against stone, while it is also submerged in water, the penetrating gaze of a confident woman. His brush also reflects back to us the darker side of Western modernity. You see, I suggested that Titian was an attentive reader of the Bible. And it is important to note that the biblical text of the book of Judith says nothing about Abra's skin color or ethnicity. It does, though, make clear that Abra was a slave. Her manumission is very quickly described at the end of the book of Judith. Judith, quote, grew old in her husband's house, reaching the age of 105. She set her maid free. That's Judith 16, chapter 16, verse 23. What we see then is that Titian's mode of reading the text has shifted between 1516 and 1570. Along with the culture around him, Titian began to see Blackness as an essential part of Abra's servitude, of her slavery. The Renaissance, and indeed history more generally, is not a place where we can escape the uglier aspects of our contemporary society. It's not a place to flee from the racialized politics of the present day, precisely because it is the moment at which the prejudices that still inform our politics inform what it means to be a people that are governed together. It is the moment when those prejudices began to crystallize. We must acknowledge this, even as we recognize that the Renaissance was a moment in which beauty became part of devotion in ways that are particular within the comparative history of religion. If Titian's paintings open new pathways for finding ethics within devotion, we must hold him to his commitments. If Titian's paintings, as I believe, still have the power to arrest us, to seduce us, to reform our ideals, what is at stake when art history or an art historian revitalizes this painting and the ideology that it reflects? And Titian struggled with his beliefs. He was a human being. In the final painting that he made, we see much of this coming to the surface. He painted this gigantic Pietà around 1575 as the altarpiece for his own tomb. He died of an outbreak of plague the next summer in the year 1576 in August. The echoes between his life and our present moment are becoming almost overwhelming. In some ways, the picture was Titian's last prayer. But what kind of prayer is it? The picture illustrates the entire process of iconic miraculous agency. A votive arm made in wax signals that someone has come to the shrine seeking healing for their arm, and they have deposited an ex voto there. Similarly, in the lower right-hand corner, we see a fictive votive tablet that is just like the fictive votive tablets that were deposited in actual miracle-working shrines. Here you see one from Naples from 1613. These testify to the miraculous healing that has already occurred to someone else. We also notice that the tablet identifies the vector of miraculous agency. You can see here in the image from Naples, the miracle working image is in the upper left-hand corner, just as it is in Titian's, right? And that image in the upper left-hand corner of Titian's fictive tablet is the center of his own altarpiece. It's the Pietà. It is the Virgin Mary holding the body of her dead son. It's clear that the Pietà at the center of the picture is identified as a miracle-working agent. So Titian has claimed a miraculous status for his own picture. That's a pretty bold move. He knew that he was going to be buried in the chapel of the cross in the Church of Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari. And by 1575, when he struck a deal with the Franciscan friars to be buried in that chapel had housed a miracle-working crucifix for almost a century. That picture was to be displaced by his own altarpiece. That is a bold and audacious mode of self-commemoration from a man who was credited by his contemporaries with painting a miracle-working icon that hung in the church that is literally next door to this one. So, in his final altarpiece, Titian provided an opening for the audience, for the faithful, to confirm this altarpiece as an icon that is on par with the miracle-working crucifix that it displaced. Titian was all too aware that charisma, miraculous charisma, cannot be controlled. He cannot force this thing to become miracle-working. So he created an apparent occasion for his charisma to be reaffirmed and to be carried forward. The picture, then, was not merely a commemoration of his life and his artistic legacy, but it was also a projection into the future of the living faith that had operated with such potency in that space and in Titian's own life. The priestly Titian that was described by Speroni in the quote with which I opened this presentation has finally come plainly into view. Titian consecrated his final work as a miracle-working icon, and thereby unequivocally revealed to us his abiding and his firm commitment to the tradition of icons. He hoped that the tradition of miraculous efficacy would continue, but he was fully aware that it was not up to him. So thank you all very much. I have just a couple of things to close with. I know that we were supposed to bring forward some bibliography, and I just wanted to very quickly say there are three great studies of Titian. Una Romandalia's Poetics of Titian's Religious Paintings from Cambridge, 2005. Jody Cranston's The Muddied Mirror, 2009, I think, or 10, Penn State Press. And then David Rozan's Painting in 16th Century Venice, which has one chapter on Titian, and Rozan was an absolutely brilliant art historian. He died a few years ago, and his writings are sorely missed. And I'd also highly recommend the edited volume by Kate Lowe, revealing the Black African presence in Renaissance Europe. And also, even more than books, with Titian, it's most important to see things. So if you ever have the chance, if you find yourself in Europe, go to Madrid and to Vienna. The Prado, as you can see here, has 43 works by Titian. They are of the utmost quality. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and the Emperor of Spain, Philip II, got all of the most choice works, and their collection is divided between Madrid and Vienna. And so those are the two places to find the absolute best works by Titian. And they really do reward very careful and close looking. So with that, I will go ahead and I guess stop sharing and bring it to a close.
Thank you so much, Professor Nygren, for this really rich presentation. And these images are just beautiful. They really capture the imagination, and your comments on them are just really, they open them up in ways that, the images I've seen a million times. I appreciate this. There's been several questions. I think we'll go ahead and get started on some of these. This idea of not only being a miracle, but not even having your image turn into a miracle working image, but also sort of indicating or anticipating that one's image is going to become that kind of an image is fascinating. We've had a couple questions about that. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about maybe the context of this as well, in the sense that this is, as you framed it nicely for us, in the 16th century, when images were being smashed all over Europe, because this was the way for especially Swiss and French and German traditions. This was how one would reform a church, right? Is to smash the statues, the images, as sort of idolatry, as pieces of idolatry, right? But here Titian is doing something very different with this image. So there's questions about this, and what kind of miracles especially were attributed to the San Rocco Christ.
Yeah, so let me begin with the San Rocco, and I'm going to go ahead and share the screen again and put this back up so that we can see it. So the closest, all miracles in this period in Italy have to be approved by a notary. So the deal is you basically present yourself in the church, and they have to be written down in a book, and they are notarized. And so those become the official miracles. In a lot of cases, the miracle book of a shrine survives. There's been really great work by a scholar named Robert Maniura, who has translated a number of the miracle books associated with a Renaissance cult in Prato, in the city of Prato, and his book called I wrote a review of it in Renaissance Quarterly. I think it's in the most recent Renaissance Quarterly. The book is called something like Miracles in Renaissance Tuscany. And he goes through the whole process. The long and short of it is the miracle book for San Rocco does not survive. What we have, though, is a short poem that was published around 1523 by a guy named Eustachio Celebrino. And that treatise, that poem basically, was based on the miracle book, and it recounts 16 of the miracles. I've translated that and I published that in Modern Language Notes a couple years ago, so you can go and look at everything that happens there. Just quickly, I would say that most of the miracles are saving people from violent events. So there's a guy named Antons Goucher, I remember, who is walking across a bridge when he gets jumped by a band of ruffians, and they attack him, and he makes recourse to the image and is saved. So that's, kind of the standard story for Renaissance miracle working images. The status of the painting in, the final altarpiece, the Pietà, as you point out, one of the things that is really so audacious about this and so interesting and makes it so, potentially problematic is that, yeah, we're on the far side of the Reformation now, right? We have had incidents of image breaking in the North in 1566, in 1522, 1523. There have been lots of instances of image breaking. Now, there is not image breaking in Italy, but Alexander Nagel, who's at the Institute of Fine Art at New York University, he suggests that what happened in Italy should be distinguished from what happened in the northern countries. So in the North, we have, what he would call hard iconoclasm, meaning you're breaking images. In Italy, he describes or he says it's a form of soft iconoclasm, meaning that they're thinking through the structural logic of how images work, what they want images to do, and how they can have images that will do the work of religion without becoming idols. And so part of what makes Titian's picture so interesting is the way that it goes through and it sort of breaks down the whole process, right? It illustrates it for you, almost as if to say, if you actually think this thing is working miracles, take a second. Ask yourself, what's the source of that miracle? It's not me, right? It's not Titian. It is the Godhead. And so there's a real consciousness that that goes into a painting like this that I think is the fruit of a man who has spent, as I said, 57 years, I guess 56 at this point, because he's still got 1 year of life left. But he's got, 56 years of laboring under the idea of what does it mean if people think I painted that picture? Was it me? Am I that powerful? Clearly I'm not, right? I can't, am I? And there's a kind of a legitimate questioning of what is his role? And that is why that painting for me is just so gripping, because it shows him believing in the potency of icons, shows him believing that, that miracles happen, and yet also really wanting to make sure that he's not actually putting himself forward as the source of those miracles. And so it's a really kind of interesting way that he choreographs the whole process. And it's kind of like, a deconstruction of the miracle process. Propitiation and recognition are both enfolded into the picture.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And now this is getting into this idea of the image calling us to conversion, right? And the imitation, right? The relationship. And as a UChicago alum, I'm sort of contractually obligated to mention sort of the Marion parallels, what we have with that discussion. We have a question on this topic from Denis on this idea of sort of going back to as you were saying, with the sort of divine emergence as Speroni thought of Ficino's painting from the divine, but also the erotic return back to the divine. Denis writes, your discussion of reditus as conversion is enlightening. In the period's theology, it was often paired with exitus, indicating not so much the turning of man to God, but God coming to and becoming man. Do you see the moment of Kairos, of reditus in Titian's paintings, like the Kairos of, maybe there's a typo. Do you see the moment of Kairos of reditus in Titian's painting, like the Kairos of exitus?
Thank you, Denis. You've of course got to come up with a tough question. So I think one of the things that any Christian painter who is operating in this century is dealing with is the idea that, and it gets back to the previous question, right? At any moment when they are making a painting, it is both. Am I not sharing? Am I sharing? No, hold on. Let me share.
Well, not right now.
Okay, share. There we go.
Here we go.
They are both creating an image that is making a claim to God coming into the world, and also obviously a fiction, right? Obviously a staging of that. And so I think one of the things that Titian is attempting throughout the course of his career. What I'm trying to chart is how that becomes difficult when miraculous agency, the miraculous agency of images, is really taken seriously. It pushes the kind of subjunctive mode of thinking to its limits and pushes it almost to a breaking point. And that is, I think, what we see in the Pietà. And in this picture, you know, I think in the London Christ with the coin, you know, Titian at this point is clearly thinking about the different ways that one gives back things. And it's interesting that you know, what he is suggesting with the inscription here is actually that the thing that you need to give back to God is in some ways more important than the thing that is given back to the emperor. So the linguistic distinction here becomes actually, I would suggest, kind of cutting the other way. It's putting the divine weight. It is putting weight into the divine category, right? You need to weigh, pendere, and to give that weight back to God. But it is a real kind of physical metaphor. It's a thinking about the way, the weight of the soul, and thinking about what is on this side as opposed to what is up above. So it's a real kind of invitation to self critique. That's where I think, you know, late Titian is becoming interesting in the realm of icon painting. I hope that answered your question, Denis. I apologize if it didn't.
No, and that's fascinating. And right on those images, the print and the original of Christ with the coin, we have a question on that. So I'll jump right to that question. Thomas asks, the rota print of Titian's icon with the coin features a halo around Jesus' head, clearly indicating his numinous divinity. But this halo does not occur in the original painting. What might account for this difference? Were there different conventions for representing Christ's divinity in different media?
So do you see my pointer?
Not right now.
No, okay. Do you see it now? No, you don't see my pointer. Okay, so if you look at the painting super closely, look just to the left of Jesus's, what is our left eye, his proper left. His proper right, our left. And you see a little tiny spark of light that is coming out. Look at the top of his head, and you see a little tiny spark of light that is popping out there. And then over in the area where it looks like there's a juncture between two blocks, there's a spark of light there as well. So Jesus does have a halo in the Titian painting. It's comparable. Let me jump up here to the image that I didn't have a chance to talk about. But the structure of the halo is quite comparable to this picture, where it's kind of, you know, you imagine that there's a fourth ray of light that is, you know, going down Jesus's neck, basically. And so that is the kind of halo that that Titian has painted in the London Christ with the coin, and Rota has sort of, you know, blown it up. He's made it go. He's turned it up to 11, right? He's just taken this thing and gone in a direction that I think Titian, you know, Titian is really about subtlety. He knows that you're going to recognize this as Jesus. He doesn't need to overwhelm you with that, and so he tries to, I think, in very subtle ways, insist upon the humanity of Christ by kind of not making the halo a full-fledged cloudburst. And Rota just goes in a totally different direction, right? You can kind of imagine that because it's a image that is just the color of the ink and the base tone of the paper, he's got to make it pop a little bit more, whereas Titian is able to do a lot more work with color.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't notice those before, but that's really yeah. Thank you for that. Going back for a second on going back to the idea of Kairos and possibly the New Testament Pauline roots of this, or possibly the philosophical roots. Sean asks, in light of your emphasis on Kairos, is there any evidence of Titian engaging with Renaissance philosophies of time, whether Neoplatonic or Aristotelian? Or would his sense of Kairos be more straightforwardly rooted in Paul and early Christianity?
That is a fine question. I think it is less philosophical. I'm trying to see if I have at the end of this, somewhere in the bottom of this PowerPoint, a particular image. I do not. So what I would say is that there are a couple of really smart German scholars, Hautfleisch und Farbe, Mariana Kuss, no, not Mariana Kuss, Valeska von Rosen, Mariana Kuss, and the third, who has written a really brilliant take on Titian's understanding of images of the Annunciation, and talking about how these images of the Annunciation are basically, they should be rightly described as the incarnation, because they're not actually the moment of, the important part isn't the angel saying, you know, Hail Mary. The important part is the inseminate, or the insertion of Christ into the womb, and the cosmic explosion that happens at that moment, right? It is an instant that changes the trajectory of the world. And where she makes the argument for that being a kind of, you know, complicating Titian's thinking, is largely theological. Now, Thomas Putfarkin, another scholar, has suggested that some of Titian's mythologies show, you know, show the influence of Aristotelian understandings of drama. And so Titian here is finding the moment of the turn in the story, the moment of revelation. That, I think, you know, other scholars are a little skeptical of whether or not Titian is actually reading Aristotle. So I would say, you know, I am a little more comfortable with the idea that he is, oh, and again, I'm not sharing the screen. Share the screen, come on. Share, okay. I'm a little more comfortable with the idea that it's more or less straightforwardly theological, his conception, because I look at this and I think he is absolutely finding the moment of the turn, right? You know, Actaeon has just stumbled upon Diana and he is going to be splashed with water, but it's not actually the moment of the transformation. It's not the moment at which he's getting hit with the water and he's starting to sprout the horns, which is what you see in a lot of woodcut illustrations of translations of Ovid from the period. But if you look really closely on the pilaster that is in the back, that is a little bit obscured by tree branches, you can see that there is a skull of an animal up there, and that's actually got horns. And Actaeon, you know, there's a case to be made that Actaeon is actually looking at that. And so the kind of strange temporality of this scene, of this moment that Titian has decided to try to capture, of both uncovering, of Diana deciding that punishment is coming, and all of it foreshadowing the moment that he's going to be transformed into a stag and eaten by his own dogs. Like, the question is, how much philosophy do you need in order to understand that? And this is one of the places where a lot of Titian scholars, you know, there's a fair amount of agreement that Titian was not terribly bookish, but he was super smart. And he paid a lot of attention to stories, whether it's Ovid or the Bible. And he just had a really keen understanding of narrative. You know, he spent his entire life thinking about how to visualize things. And so when he's telling, you know, you can imagine when he's hanging out with Pietro Aretino, Aretino is probably a really, you know, great storyteller. Titian tells stories with his hands. He tells stories with paint. And so how philosophical he needs to be is a kind of open question. And while I find him absolutely engaged with theological speculation, it tends to be stuff that's pretty readily available. So glossa ordinaria kind of stuff, like really basic text that he can read, all of that stuff that I was talking about with Christ with the coin. When you boil it down, it's actually really simple, just as a coin is stamped with the image of the person that made it, so too is your soul stamped with God's image. Like, it's a really basic parallel that has an incredibly rich bibliography of exegesis behind it. But when you break it down to its like most essential parts, is quite easily digestible for somebody who wasn't all that interested in reading theology.
Thank you. And it was something that came to mind is in your comments as well, was the kind of parallel with Ignatius Loyola, who also wants to paint images in your imagination of a kind of moment, right? Putting you in relationship with Christ in a certain scene. I mean, maybe there's no similarity there, but it just comes to my mind as something like that.
No, I would say Loyola is doing something, and especially Jerome Nadal, right, who's a generation or so after, and he's the guy who comes up with really the prints that are used to train all of the Jesuits in the late 16th, early 17th century. And Jesuit images, they become about making a scene and walking you through it, right? So they'll have a print that's yay big, and it will have 1, 2, 3, 4, or A, B, C, D, and then down below a description of all of the different moments. They are really into walking you through it, whereas I think Titian is more about overwhelming you with the kind of that moment, right? He wants it to seem as though you're present. And when Jesus says, whose image is on the coin, like, you're right up there, you're pressed against the screen. And Titian wants to create the sensation that Jesus is talking to you. Whereas Nadal and Ignatius are much more, I don't want to say detached, that's not the right word, but strategic in the way they walk you through something. Whereas I think Titian is more about a kind of overwhelming phenomenon. He wants to create a saturated moment, right?
Yeah. I want to come back before we end to talk about the sort of thickening anti-Black racism that we brought up. But before that, we have another question from a viewer, from Terrence, who wants to ask about the medieval and modernity, medievalism and modernism of the iconography. Terrence asks, how does Titian's use of icons disrupt certain ideas of the Renaissance as modern rather than medieval?
Yeah, I mean, so back to screen share. Hold on. The kind of dominant narrative of Titian's place in the history of art is really based around, these kinds of images of mythologies of naked lady in a landscape, naked lady in a palace, in the case of the Venus of Urbino. And, it's obvious that Velázquez is thinking about this. It's obvious that Manet is thinking about this. And those are the images that are celebrated in a lot of the 19th century biographies of Titian. They are the images that are celebrated in the early 20th century and all through the 20th century, actually. At the moment, if you are fortunate enough to be in London, you can see the Poesie. So the painting in the upper left is one of the 6 Poesie that is currently on display in London. And these are 6 mythological paintings that were given to Philip II, right? And for a long time, scholarship has really looked at Philip II as kind of backward, because as far as we can tell, he didn't really like these paintings of naked ladies, because at a certain point, he has a kind of real conversion to thinking about, you know, kind of abstemiousness in all forms. And yet he's commissioning Titian the whole way through. And he's, you know, asking for paintings like this one. You know, this is the kind of painting that Philip really likes. And so if Titian scholarship has really dismissed Philip as kind of, you know, being retrograde and not with it because he doesn't understand, you know, the progressive thing that Titian is doing, which is putting, you know, mythologies into pictorial form or showing the human body. If Philip has been really criticized for that, part of what I'm trying to do is show that, you know, Philip isn't quite as out of it as we think. He's picked up on a particular form of Titian's pictorial intelligence that is equally important. And so, you know, I don't know. I don't know where modernity begins. I don't know where the Middle Ages end. What I do know is that it's not in some moment when a particular pictorial genre takes over. And if Titian's story has been told for a very long time, emphasizing that kind of, those paintings which look good in a museum. That's the other thing to think about, is like that category of image, naked lady in a landscape or mythology or whatever. Like those were intended for a wall, right? They were intended for a wall in a palace. Some of those palaces became museums, like the Louvre, you know, began as the king's palace. The Uffizi began as the duke's palace, and paintings hung naturally on those walls. When you take a painting like the Christ with the coin and you put it in a museum, it's a little bit weird, right? It's kind of out of context. When you take an altarpiece and you put it in a museum, it's out of context. And so there's a whole way that the way we've narrated, you know, the important parts of Titian has mapped onto the emergence of the museum, which that is a modern thing, right? And so part of what I'm trying to do is show that there's another red thread that, you know, Titian is capacious enough to include multiple narratives, to include multiple red threads. And yeah, some of those might go into modernity, but some of them don't. Some of them are decidedly early modern or Renaissance or whatever. They're not like a part of that kind of teleological idea of the emergence of art history, of the art museum, of those things.
Thank you. But medieval or modern, he still speaks to us today. And I really appreciate how in your presentation of Titian's paintings as addressing us as viewers, putting us in relationship, not with the painting as an object, but with Christ through it. In your presentation, you've also refused to let us as viewers look at Titian's paintings as objects, but have really critically sort of enacted that call to conversion in terms of prejudice, anti-Black racism, the thinking of it then, the present situation with it. And I appreciate also this, like bringing this to us, and also bringing us this sort of hermeneutic or way of viewing, the stance that allows us to appreciate with also critiquing. I was wondering if you would just want to close with some of your personal reflections on how we can maintain that kind of self-converting posture in regards to these or other objects or other things.
Yeah, I mean, I'll thank you for saying that, because I was unsure how these are my reflections on what it means to have the book come out in 2020, in the summer of 2020. And of course, the way academic publications work is, you know, the text is more or less finished, you know, 2 years, 3 years before that. And it just takes forever for these things to come out. And this summer forces one to confront the blind spots in our own understandings of the things that we study. And I think that, as I said, if Titian has a power if Titian's paintings still have a power to call to us in some way, and if part of what I think my job is, and part of what I try to do as an art historian, is to revitalize the kind of spiritual elements within a Titian picture, to show how smart he was when it came to thinking about theological issues, I came up short when it came to dealing with these pictures in my book, and I need to own that. I need to take that one on the chin, and I need to do better. And I have to ask myself, what does it mean if part of what we're trying to do is think about what elements of traditions are carried forward into the present moment, what elements of America's founding or of the Renaissance are we comfortable living with, and what elements are we not comfortable living with? What does it mean to revitalize a painting, two paintings like this? What's at stake there? And what is the act that I as an art historian can do to both acknowledge the role that paintings like these play in the emergence of anti-Black racism, without saying that they're the cause of it, without saying that Titian himself bears the weight of the Atlantic slave trade, which more or less postdates him. Neither is he culpable, nor can we entirely let him off the hook, in the same way that we cannot allow ourselves off the hook. And so it's a very hard, it's a summer of a lot of introspection, I think, for many of us. And as I was sort of thinking about the book that I've written and what I wish to say about it, part of what I want to say is that there is no way to fully sever Titian from this moment, just as there's no way to say he's responsible for it. And that's a really uncomfortable recognition for someone like me who has, basically dedicated his life to studying Titian. And I just have to work through that. And I and the field of art history, we have a lot of work to do to help us see our own blind spots. We cannot simply perpetuate the blind spots that Titian had, or that Michelangelo had, or that Caravaggio had, or that Velázquez had. There is a power in confronting the fact that Velázquez, another amazing painter, had a slave who was a mulatto and manumitted him. And when he manumitted him, he taught him how to paint. That's both, inspiring and terrible, right? And we have to live with that. We have to, as art historians working on early modernity, learn to confront that in ways that are not allowing ourselves to simply put it under the rug anymore. That's just, the summer of 2020 has shown me that that's not possible anymore.
Professor Nygren, thank you so much for this call to conversion and bringing Titian to us as calls for self-inspection and conversion as well. And this is tremendous presentation.
Thank you, guys.
Great, indeed. And on behalf of Lumen Christi, thank you for this feast for our eyes and also for our intellect. And I'd invite our viewers to join us for our upcoming events that are continuing this introspection that Professor Nygren has pointed out. We have an event this Thursday, Chicago Catholics in the Quest for Interracial Justice, that actually looks at the history in the 30s to the 60s, where Black and white lay Catholics and clergy here in Chicago were trying to cross both segregated neighborhoods, but also segregated parishes. So they're looking to the past can also show us that people have also acted creatively, as Professor Nygren has pointed out. And then join us again next week on Thursday for COVID and the color line, attending to what has been coming out in the news about the asymmetries of the impact of COVID on communities of color. Join us as we have ethicists and medical doctors and theologian Vincent Lloyd sort of helping moderate this conversation as we pick through these. And I'd invite you to support us, especially by helping share word about these events to those who might benefit from them. Thank you again, Professor Nygren. Thank you, Rob, for moderating this conversation. And thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. All the best.
Thank you.